Welcome to the next sessions of the 988 conference. I'm really jealous about the other sessions going on, so I'm glad they're being recorded and we have all the slide decks. I'm Michelle Macarai, I'm an LCSW, and I am the Clinical Program Training Coordinator here at Crisis Support Services. It's really an honor to be with you for the second annual conference. And I'd like to start with a land acknowledgement as well. To acknowledge our presence on the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territory of the Ohlone Chochenyo people. I recognize that the abundance I have, the growth we've had, is built on great loss and displacement of the original tenders of this land. And welcome to you, welcome to our ancestors and our elders and our relatives, past, present, and emerging. While Nargis said earlier, land acknowledgements are a stepping stone to honoring broken treaty relationships. This acknowledgement is a beginning of the reflection of how can we rematriate this land. And I also want to acknowledge that we are who we are in this room. I'm a social worker and a griever. You might be a clinician, but we all have our many identities, and you have your lived experience, I have my lived experience, that we are all in it together. And so you may be experiencing some tenderness with this topic. And I just want to start with hoping that we can navigate this conversation with compassion and tenderness together. So, and I'm looking over here at my notes as well. So if it looks like I'm not paying attention, I truly am. I'm just a little bifocused. I'm hoping to build in some time as well in this conversation for your questions and your perspectives. But as we go through this next almost hour, we're going to focus on the goals, the learning goals of describing how suicide bereavement is different from non-suicide death loss, understand the importance of postvention, and learn some helpful ways to support a suicide loss survivor. So again, expanding this conversation that this does not need to only happen or occur in therapy. This is a larger connection. Thanks, Nargis. This is so great that you're taking care of the slides. It's a real gift. So, as you know, Crisis Support Services, we have the crisis line. We learned so much about 988 and what's happening, but our clinical program services are incredibly vital, also really thriving and continuing to develop. And what we offer here, we supervise interns who are, or associates who are in graduate programs or accruing hours for licensure. And we supervise them to provide individual therapy for people who are in grief, for our elders, and some school-based services. And we are really grateful to be able to provide this service to people who don't have access otherwise. We also have groups that are offered on a pretty regular basis in fall, winter, and spring. We have a general loss grief group. We have a suicide loss grief group. We also have a building connections social skills group for those 55 and over. And right now I'm facilitating a group that I call Tending Your Grief, which is a drop-in grief group at the Oakland Public Library, 81st Avenue branch in East Oakland. It's on Tuesday nights at 6:15. You're always welcome. And that group has been really wonderful because it's not only people who are grieving the loss of a physical loved one, but also symbolic losses. So relationship, job loss, moves and migration, and also health status. So that is a pretty open, overlapping, incredible experience to be a part of. And I'm really, I feel so grateful to be connected to it. We also offer consultation. So if we get a lot of calls from other providers, as you may have already called our voicemail line to figure out what services might be available for someone, how do you support someone in their grief or their isolation, and you can visit our website for more information. And we do these one-time community grief events when there's been something sudden or traumatic happening, and we hold space. So that's our services in a nutshell. And to also kind of let you know kind of how we approach this work. Our stance is strengths-based. We really look at the systems and the environment as contributing to a problem, not a person as the problem. And we really try to decenter ourselves as experts. We have a commitment and a real ethic of providing support for people in crisis, but we don't ever place ourselves as the expert or the idea of knowing that we know what a person should do. We really believe in a person and their strengths and their abilities and their experience to grow. We also hold connection and community, and we are really grounding ourselves in our anti-racist practices as well, like who we are and all our intersectionality identities and how we connect with people in that partnership and that collaboration. And we're grief informed. And you might be saying, what is that? Well, we are grief informed in the sense of like trauma informed care. Grief informed care is a model that values lived experience, and it upholds that healthy adaptation to grief. So healthy adaptation to grief, that's like kind of clinical language, but like the way we will hold and experience and carry our grief is with all of these principles, that it's natural. Grief is a natural response to loss, and we all will experience it. It's nothing. This kind of flows into how the second principle or kind of idea is that this is non-pathological and complex. All grief is complex. We don't diagnose grief as a problem in our program. Excuse me. And there is, sort of a consideration of ruling out prolonged grief, but we really hold that a person in their strengths and in their experience will move through this. Also, contextual grief is not just an individual experience. What's happening in their environment and what's happening in their systems, what's their age, their developmental stage is really important and has to be considered. All the stresses. I guess if that's a way, so that was a really long-winded way of saying that grief does not occur in like one particular area of a person's life, which goes into the fourth idea that this is a disruptive experience. Grief is disruptive to our emotions. Sure, I feel like a lot of people know that grief is an emotional experience, but it's also a physical, a cognitive, and a spiritual experience. Our identities, our relationships, our assumptive beliefs, and assumptive beliefs being what we carry knowing about the world, whether it's something that's told to us explicitly or something that we just know from being in our families of origin, like that the world is a safe place, that good things happen to good people, that suicide would never happen to me. Those are beliefs that all get disrupted and kind of thrown up in the air. And there's a real time and space needed to process and redefine this. Grief informed also means that healthy adaptation to grief involves a relational connection and perceived support. So this doesn't mean what I'd sort of say like, oh, that person has a phenomenal amount of support, or they have very little support. That means that I ask a person, how do you view your support? What's around you? What's in your support circle? So it's up to them. It's a real quality over quantity type of situation. Also, grief informed means involving personal empowerment and agency. This is a person's, they are also deciding what they want to talk about, what their goals are, what they want to speak to. And then there's also safety. We always assess for suicide risk. We bring that conversation forward. I also wrote, obviously it's person-centered. My grief is so different from your grief. Your grief is so different from that other person's grief. It is not a one-size-fits-all. I guess I'll also just give a plug here that we do not uphold the stages of grief as like a checklist to get through. grief is a dynamic experience and it moves and changes all the time. And so one of the group members had said like, oh, I hate when people ask, how are you? Like that question is, one, is somebody really listening to the answer? And two, the dynamic changing nature of grief is, how are you doing today? How are you really doing? And do we really have that space to hold it? And finally, the grief-informed sort of stance is that grief is non-finite. So again, not running through a checklist, not having this sense of like, even though we have 3 days of bereavement leave from work, like we're not done. Like it's not something that you can sort of close a door on. It's something that becomes part of our identity. It's interwoven into our life, and we are defining a new normal. These principles can be seen on Dougy Center's website, dougy.org, and you'll be getting all of these slides as well. I'm going to try to monitor the chat too a little bit. Oh yeah, thanks Nargis. So suicide grief is different from non-suicide death loss. Yes, they are both intense experiences. It's all grief, right? But very similar to sudden and unexpected violent deaths. And I'm thinking currently, of course, of people who die by overdose. Prominent grief symptoms, like that are maybe more prominent a little bit, are the shock and disbelief. How could this happen? That shock can really carry forward for so much time. The yearning can be incredibly intense, and not that it's not intense in other types of losses, but this yearning, I think, is really deeply connected to that shock. Like I spoke to before, the disruption of the assumptive world. What does it mean to be in this world now? What is safety? The higher levels of post-traumatic stress symptoms. The why. Making sense of this takes so much time and may not ever really be answered. And this can lead to guilt and anger and blame. Fear that it might happen again and have a heightened sense of self-doubt, rejection and abandonment. And of course, Jordan found in 2017 that survivors are at increased risk of suicide. And this is understudied, but a known. And so I wanted to also really appreciate and honor Jill Harrington's work. She's a doctorate in social work. She's a researcher, and she wrote a book called Superhero Grief, The Transformative Power of Loss, in collaboration with Robert Niemeyer, who's a grief researcher, writer as well. She's done a lot of research on bereavement in the military, and she has a lot of her webinar is what I'm drawing from today. She did a webinar called Suicide, Bereavement, and Postvention Support. And that's through the Center for Prolonged Grief at Columbia University. And this webinar helped me kind of get grounded in this work as well. So the mourning process, and mourning meaning the grief process, what grief looks like. This may be the next slide, Nargis. So what the grief process might look like after suicide. So this is for clinicians, it's for ourselves, it's for supporting our friends and community. There might be a greater need to seek explanation and make sense of the death. And so I remember co-facilitating a suicide loss grief group a year and a half ago. And there was such a need to go over the story, to go over the details and cycle through. And was this suicide? Was it not? Is there a way it could have been something else? And there's just the need to take space with that. Greater levels of guilt and perceived responsibility. And perceived doesn't mean that anybody else is saying it to a survivor, but was this kind of why, along with the why is, what did I miss? What did I not see? If I had only known, and how would I have known? That needs an incredible amount of space and tenderness. And and it's repetitious. It's not something that we sort through once and think, okay, well, we talked about that. So we talked about that on Tuesday. So I guess I'm done with that now. That this is really a constant presence. There are greater levels of stigmatization and shame, and a possible need to conceal the mode of death. So as we all know, depending on our views in our own personal culture, there is such a view of suicide as a sin or as a crime, or there's so much that's carried, and people really are scared to bring this forward in community, and there's so much silence, and that grief is such a lonely place, that to feel even more alone within that aloneness is just such a heavy weight for someone to carry. And also this mourning or grief process after suicide, a person might both have a real and perceived experience that they're going to have less social support. And there's also more avoidance. What do we say? What can we say to a person when we don't have words? We don't know if it's okay to bring it up. They don't know if it's okay to bring it up, so they don't go and speaking to it. So avoidance, withdrawal, more isolation, less connection. Exposure to the loss of a loved one to suicide increases the chances of suicidal thinking and behavior in the exposed person. So that's a lot to hold too, that this is possible, this is a possibility. Finally, the perception of intentionality is the most distinguishing factor from non-suicide grief. So holding that of, as a survivor, this person decided to do that. That feels and is so different from what other grievers carry. So suicide survivors will speak to, like, well, if it was cancer, or if it was an accident, that feels different. I feel talking about it as a different experience, and people will know and like sort of say, like, have an understanding, whereas suicide grief doesn't have that same sort of frame of reference. Thank you, Nargis. And so we really hold, as I'm going through my own slides here too, we don't, like I said, we don't hold with the stages of grief or what you're supposed to do to move through it. We really hold these loss integration tasks. So we focus upon strengthening a positive support circle and managing negative relationships. So that means talking about where does a person feel less alone? Where do they feel like they have the place to be themselves? And that's where the grief groups that I've facilitated in the past, it's such a moment of respite, right? Like such a moment of relief to be somewhere where you can really be yourself. And the negative relationships that either were existing before a loss or start to become negative after a loss are a lot to navigate too. A person, as an example, a griever in a group, in that suicide loss group, wasn't invited to birthday parties of her cousin's children. And it wasn't, nothing was said, right? So there's like a whole story, like, did this person not invite me because they don't want me around? This griever wondered, but also, like, was it a protective, like it was a person trying to be protective of not wanting to make her come to a birthday party when she didn't have her child anymore. Like that felt so negative to her. That felt like such an invisibility. And so there's sort of that, like, sort of unsaid, maybe nonverbal relationship that starts to feel negative, of a person who was supportive to me is not supportive to me, either by their absence or maybe by truly saying something that is so harmful about what that person believes about suicide or what happens afterward, or judgment. Sorry, I got a little bit like off topic, giving my example. Other tasks involve repair and transformation of the relationship with the person who died. So we uphold here that the bonds of our relationship with our loved ones continue even though they have died and are not here physically any longer. So we encourage conversation. This idea of the continuing bonds of relationship, there can be healing, there can be connection. We don't believe it's over. And we believe of speaking of that person. What would they say? How would they see you now? And really kind of locating that internal positive connection. That can be quite healing for people, instead of never speaking their name, of holding that silence, really encouraging that connection. We also believe that the development of a durable biography of the deceased is necessary, because so much time and attention and energy is spent on the shock, the disbelief, the perceived responsibility, the intentionality, maybe the traumatic circumstances of the death, that in our wholeness, we want to see everybody in their wholeness. Who are they in life as well as their death? And how can we speak about this loved one with both aspects of themselves in life and then also their death? Finally, reinvestment in living, which doesn't mean forgetting or ignoring or moving on or letting go. We don't abide by that, but really the relationship with, so a survivor's relationship with their loved one is not their only identity. So there's a sense of integration. That's what we focus upon, integration of grief into our life, and also enhancing well-being and coping. So nowhere in that do we say like, move on or get over it. Those are such painful phrases to hear. And for the next slide, you all probably know what postvention is, but just so that we have a shared definition, it's any activity following a suicide that promotes healing among those affected by the death. It can help buffer any negative effects of suicide, such as prolonged grief, suicide contagion, and suicide. And as Schneidman says, postvention is prevention. We also want to be in connection with people. It doesn't have to be therapy. There are so many other ways, obviously, to be of support and be in community with someone following a suicide, but postvention is after that loss. So much attention and support is needed. Okay, so now that we have this shared sort of definition, postvention needs, which I think is the next slide, are on, great. This is Jill Harrington's work. What they have found is, so we need to start with a suicide risk assessment, and we need to go in with that consistently, without stigma, without judgment, because we know a person who's exposed to suicide also is at increased risk. Crisis support, what an overwhelming experience. What a trauma. So crisis support in those moments, right after death, in those weeks and months after death. We need to look at the treatment of trauma-related symptoms. So how is a person having intrusive thoughts? Is there hypervigilance? Really just exploring, what is this grief reaction like for this person? Someone that I see spoke of after the death of her daughter, her language is beautiful. And she said, I sat down for a year. I sat down. She couldn't do in the same way. She couldn't engage in life in the same ways. And she gave away, and when we spoke about suicide risk, she said, I gave away my plants. And that wasn't her making a plan. It wasn't her saying, I'm done. But it was her saying that I didn't want to be in life in the way I was. And she didn't have an intention or means or a plan, but she did not see what this life was for. And she is not necessarily just sitting down right now. It's been a few years, but it was so disruptive. Her life could not go on the way it had. So psychoeducation can happen in therapy, but it can happen in peer support. It can happen by other survivors. What is grief? People ask all the time, even though we're all humans and loss is a part of our lives. What is grief? So psychoeducation about what grief is, what suicide is, and also bibliotherapy, which is a fancy word for like, let's look at books, let's learn, let's listen, let's read. And this can be about grief, self-help, what we communicate to our families, what we communicate to children, sleep therapy or sleep hygiene, again, because this is very much a physical experience, just as much as an emotional and spiritual experience. We need to tend to our basic needs. There's practical assistance. Some people are never ready to go through closets or belongings. Sometimes that's really necessary to clean houses, to, all of the things that are undone to attend to, just like legal and financial counseling. So these concrete aspects are really needed. And when a person is so ungrounded and untethered in grief, this is incredibly helpful. Long-term grief and trauma therapy, if needed, anything that boosts a person's well-being and coping. Of course, I'm going to plug and uplift or suicide-specific peer support groups. A place of belonging, a place of respite, a place of being able to share story. Again, with agreements from other members in the room. Is this okay to talk about? Can we all hold this? Social support, I think, is pretty self-explanatory. This whole term of thanatechnology, the internet space we take up, right? Like, what is that person's social media presence? How do we communicate with others? What do we want to say? What is their presence like? And is there a way to navigate that? And it also speaks to how we can get support 24 hours with groups online. I focus upon this one a lot in therapy or counseling, meaning making and loss integration. So I spoke about the loss integration before, but the meaning making is very specific and very personal. A lot of people, most people grow up with some idea that they've decided upon or has grown of like, what do they think happens after death? What's do I believe in a heaven or hell or reincarnation, or is it all done? And this throws all of that, right? That there's that disruption. Maybe I don't know what happens. Maybe I don't believe that. And that's a huge exploration to uphold. What does this mean? What does it mean to have died? And then also, what does it mean to have died by suicide? So I like to make a lot of time for this, and it doesn't always mean that it's done verbally. Sometimes this can be done through writing, sometimes art exercises. I think that meaning making and loss integration really focuses upon movement, and it's dynamic and dimensional. And then peace with the why. That's a little bit aspirational. I would say that's not something that's realistic to figure out or come to any kind of resolution with in postvention. I think that's more of like an ongoing ongoing practice as a griever from suicide loss. And then I think the next, oh yeah, thank you, Nargis. So there was a study done, and this was in 2016. Sorry, I'm going to my own slides too. And this was Sanford, and there were 200 grievers that he and other researchers talked to in Australia and the United States. And they did this great qualitative research. What is helpful in therapy when we are surviving suicide loss? And they found some amazing qualities that are helpful in therapy, but I think can be expanded outside of therapy. And that is the therapeutic alliance. So that speaks to a therapist and client relationship, that there's rapport, that there's trust, there's a sense of safety, there's a sense of being known and being seen. But that can be expanded to our relationships with our community, right? Where do we feel alliance? Where do we feel trust? This is really foundational. And then listening. And listening, not listening without kind of the investment in the what happened and tell me all the details. Sometimes it's that, but a lot of times it's listening to wherever a survivor wants to go. They may not want to talk about all the details. They may want to talk about this process that they find themselves in. They may not need to be detectives at a certain point in wrestling with the whys. It's listening wherever a person is. And then concrete psychoeducation on suicide loss and suggestions. And suggestions really, if a person wants those, if they're bringing this as a what do you think, but really suggestions I would hold lightly, but really having a space for that education. Normalizing and validating feelings. People in grief often talk about how they feel like they're losing it, or they're going crazy, or they don't understand what's happening. And so to have a space where they can say, like, this is happening for me. Am I losing it? Like, am I going crazy? Because so many times in grief, we feel so many things at once. We can feel incredible despair. We can feel so much pain and anger. We can also feel relief that maybe suffering is over. So that is a lot to hold at one time. And I think that we really need to validate that that's grief and you're okay. Again, room to grieve without pushing for resolution. I just want to speak to that for a minute. Just because we have a conversation with someone in therapy or outside therapy about maybe that element of feeling relief or feeling gratitude for the relationship that was present, that doesn't mean that the next conversation you have is like, okay, done with that, figured that out. There isn't that sense of resolution that I think we really all carry in this society that really values production and efficiency, achievement. And that I think is, grounded in white supremacy, that grief is the opposite of that. There's nothing to be achieved here. We're not going to check this off a list, and we're not going to be done. This is really an ongoing process of exploration, of sorting through things. And so I guess I would, in therapy, it's really great to hold that just because there was some really beautiful perspective that was gained, doesn't mean the next week that it's going to be moving on. So same in all of our relationships in community with family and friends. We won't necessarily be done or have anything. I guess the metaphor I think of is it's not going to be tied up. There's not going to be a bow on this. So yeah. And then what suicide loss survivors also found really helpful was that it wasn't the survivor's fault. That's gigantic. And that needs a lot of space and time. And same as we talked about, or I talked about in the grief groups, the ability to say things in therapy they couldn't say elsewhere, that safe, trusting space, and the encouragement to talk about the person who died and the details of the death. Being a person, and so being a therapist, if you are a therapist out there, like knowing your own limits too, like what do you have space and capacity for, and where do you also need to take extra care and time and space for yourself, because this is heavy and it's a lot, and it's great to be genuine in what you can offer and provide. And that might mean doing more readings, more education, more consultation. So before I go past this, therapist qualities that were not helpful was also explored. And those qualities that suicide loss survivors found not helpful were a lack of experience with suicide bereavement, unhelpful suggestions. There are a million. I'm not going to go into like discussion about what those unhelpful suggestions are. I'm sure this room has so many experiences of that. Avoiding grief. So that is getting back to our own personal experience and stance. Do we avoid grief? Do we not want to talk about it? If we don't make space for that in therapy, that's going to be unhelpful, and at the least to grievers. And also a lack of empathy and authenticity was found to be unhelpful, which makes sense. But it was researched and officially found. And so what can we do? We can be present. And what does being present mean? Next slide, please, Nargis. The chaplain, Zach Wheat, was on a podcast, Grief Out Loud, by the Dougie Center, and it was titled How to Show Up for Others. He's a palliative care chaplain in hospitals, and he facilitates groups as well. And he referenced a lot of this, like show up, like really just show up. And I think of that sound, that sounds so simple, but really I'm thinking of another therapist. Her name is Megan Devine. She wrote, It's Okay That You're Not Okay. She also wrote How to Carry What Cannot Be Fixed. And she writes, you don't have to be perfect, just be present. So you can show up and say, I don't know what to say, but I'm here. And we don't have to put our opinions on another person. We don't have to put our speculation or our own questioning, but just showing up. And acknowledgement, like not saying, I'm sorry, not saying, I'm thinking about you and this must be really difficult. Not acknowledging the death is a huge disservice to a person. It's very disconnecting to not have that be acknowledged. And leading with empathy, not leading with sympathy, not leading with feeling sorry for someone, but really trying to join in that moment. And that's hard. Opening ourselves up to suffering, someone else's suffering, is really hard. And then being authentic, like he said, like if you don't know, it's okay, just say, I don't know. And if people want more readings, which you're going to get this link, Samaritans is another crisis support organization that has some great books and other readings. And so I know I've been doing a lot of talking and I have not been monitoring the chat at all. But this is a time of, I just want to give you my gratitude for being here and also being patient with all of my talking. I don't know if I left a lot of time for us to talk. I think we have about 10 minutes for questions and perspectives. I can maybe not share screens too, so I can see you. And I think we are recording. And we do, that's right. Thank you, Nargis, for mentioning the group that we have once a month for clinicians as grievers from client deaths. that meets once a month, I think on Friday mornings, I think. And one of our members is a co-facilitator here, Danielle Gary. Well, I can also try to get the flyer as well.
Yeah, I'm looking online right now to drop.
Thanks. And I saw Hillary had a question. Hillary, nice to chat with you again. Send you that info too. We can talk more about it if you want.
Was that in reference to the group or?
Yeah, this is Danielle. Yeah, thank you.
Oh, hi.
Hi.
Were there questions or thoughts? I feel like I'm trying to go through the chat at the same time, but I'd welcome anyone's thoughts.
I just want to share my reflection and also just what a deep presentation you've provided, Michelle. So thank you so much. You honor so many people's experience, and I, recognize that it's a privilege to be part of that today. So I would like to, one of the things, the observation I made in the comments was about the person who gave away plants, right? And I just want to, the point that you made is really nuanced about giving things away, right? So for newer clinicians on the call, one of the things we're often trained around is, when people start to give things away, it can be a red flag. I just really was struck by the prominence of giving away living things such as plants, right? And that feels really cathartic. So just want to lift that into the conversation and say thank you.
Thank you, Carla. Right, like there was something so profound about this person's experience with how she engaged with living things. And it also was something that deeply connected her to her daughter. And so it was not only like a disconnection from living and tending to something thriving, but it was also a question of this connection and relationship with plants was something I had with my daughter. I don't know if I can continue this. And so, in grief work, grief spaces, there's so much about metaphor, but this was one of those examples where it was like, oh, metaphor and reality coming together. Danielle.
Thanks so much, Michelle. That was just a really beautiful presentation, and something that really struck me was grief is a natural response. How you spoke about it being a healthy response to death. And I think we often, as providers, we hear someone's grieving and we want to make a referral and make sure the grief gets solved. And that, like, it's really, I don't know, I just like how you brought to life that it's really an ongoing process and quite beautiful and natural. And it doesn't end when, like, someone comes to a point of feeling some relief or expressing relief.
Right. Thank you, Danielle. Yes, that I think that there are a lot of referrals made, or like, we've got to do something about this. But actually, Kathy Shear, who's at the Center for Prolonged Grief, is like, you all who actually like has really championed prolonged grief being a disorder, has said most grief will be adapted to beautifully without any clinical or professional support. It is something that we adapt to naturally if it's not interfered with by stressors or something that she calls derailers. And it's like grief is such a wild, consuming experience, but it doesn't need to be contained with, I think that's like us wanting it to be contained. I feel, Nargis, like, were you being great about keeping us on time?
Oh, we're fine on time. I was just dropping links in the chat, but I was going to say something about like access to rituals as something that I think about a lot. And during COVID, a lot of people lost access to rituals, be it like a funeral or whatever. like culturally appropriate gatherings that they would have held. But people who die by suicide, like their loved ones, often lose access to rituals even without COVID being present. And I'm thinking about like attending a funeral for a loved one of my colleagues who had died by suicide. And they weren't allowed to hold this service in their usual place of worship because that place refused to host funerals for people who died by suicide.
Mhm.
And I thought about the like isolation and like further marginalization of that message. So like loss of access to rituals is just such a like poignant thing that I hold for folks who lose someone to suicide, is because the loss is delegitimized because of that.
Exactly. Thank you for highlighting something that I had in my notes, and I totally forgot to mention that that is post-vention as well, is ritual. And if we don't make space for that according to somebody's faith, but really according to also how they are making meaning in the world, we can't deny or diminish that. And I feel like a lot of people put, this is my own personal opinion, by the way, I feel like a lot of people put ritual in places of religion only, and that isn't what is necessary. Like if we're going to truly be inclusive, we're on that journey together. And what does a ritual look like that does feel honoring, that does feel inclusive, that does feel fitting? And sometimes those rituals that a person did have great attachment to or feels rejected from, everything's up for redefinition. I'm so sorry for your friend's loss to the just that further isolation is like what you, Carla, wrote of that stigma is just so harmful.
Yeah, and I had even reflected on it in the chat earlier of like her being a mental health provider, feeling the additional guilt of like, I should have seen it. How did I miss it? And one step further of like the external blame of like, how did like you lived with this person? How did you let this happen? That felt really present throughout the entire.
Right. And it's not our place necessarily to say, have an answer to it or give an intellectual response. It is like, this is what's up for you. Carla, I feel like you might have raised a hand. And
No, I was just going to say, not just while you were speaking, I was thinking about like survivor's guilt and related, relation to that, which is so much the experience of mental health providers, right? So, yeah, just that we have to get past this as a culture, right? And as a people. Yeah.
I'm feeling like being mindful of time. Thank you so much, Carla, for helping us like maybe kind of end on that. We will find that flyer. I really apologize for not.
Yeah, the version I found online was older, but here, I will put my email in the chat here and folks can
and Danielle might have a thought of when it's happening.
Yeah, I just forget the cadence of it and I don't want to give wrong information.
I want to say it's the third
Friday
of the month. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm not sure when are we? What's the date for the third Friday?
Today is the fifth Friday, I think, but yeah. Put my email in the chat. If you're interested, email me and we'll send you the flyer for the next one. But also if you follow us on Instagram, we do post about it like usually the week of, but we'll try and get it together and email you if you reach out to me. I put my email in the chat.
Yeah, and it's an open group, so you can just pop in or there are people that return on a monthly basis as well. And we're really happy to have anyone join.
All right.
It's not clinical supervision and it's not therapy. It's just a place for providers to talk about death of clients.
Thank you so much for being here and opening and welcoming us to the group, Danielle. I'm so glad to see you all. Thank you for your caring. Thank you for your tenderness and grace. And I hope you have a beautiful afternoon.